Dear Claude, I write to you now not only because I still consider you my friend, but because you are the only veterinarian in my memory who would read this letter to its conclusion. I think especially of the tales you relayed to me of happenings on your grandfather's ranch, which I did not believe at the time, but I look back on now with less doubt. Were you still living there now, as you were then, I would almost certainly be concerned for your safety. As it is, I hope this letter finds you in better health than the health in which I find myself. As I have not slept well in about a week, you might excuse the errors that are likely to appear in this letter. 7 days ago, I took off westward from Cincinnati with my brother Caleb. As you are aware, we left Kentucky for Ohio to reside with our cousin and to get work from our uncle. Since then, our uncle died. We found ourselves without coin and generally dissatisfied with our surroundings, so we pointed our beaks westward and set out, as is the fashion. For nigh on 2 weeks, we made it just fine until we hit Shepherdsville, Missouri. The people there were a quiet bunch. Nobody there was unfriendly or impolite in most respects, but they seemed inclined to hang their heads like children who had just been scolded by their mamas. It was no obstacle to purchase the supplies that we required from the shopkeepers, nor was it any trouble getting a drink from their saloon. You should know that when I'm traveling, I don't mind being in quiet company, but it was too eerie for even me, and especially bothersome to Caleb. The most conversation I got out of anyone was in the bar. I told the barkeep that we were heading west into the woods from there, and he told me that we ought not. I asked him what for, and he mumbled back, saying something akin to, "It ain't right," or "wouldn't be right." Another patron next to us advised to avoid those woods at all costs. Head down south or north a day or so if we had to first. Nobody would elaborate. Caleb and I weren't keen on wasting days. I thought back long and hard on that circumstance, and I speculate that there was no possibility of us not going into that forest. I wish to God that he'd arranged fate differently, or softened our wills on that day. At dawn, we followed the trail into the woods with our horses, Hatchet and Pinky. Pinky's mine, and I call him that because he's mostly white, and his hair is slightly thinner around his face than is usual for a horse, meaning that a good bit of his snout has a pink hue to it. The trail started out wide and well-worn, but about a mile in it started getting thin, and it went up against the ledge. When it got as thin could be, we heard a knock. After we heard it a second time, we found it to be my horse Pinky snapping his comps down on his bit, his lips pulled back in a pearly frown. I took this to mean that he was nervous, so I got off Pinky and walked out in front of him so he wouldn't buck me over the edge or do something similarly unpleasant. My brother did the same as I, though his horse had been doing fine. Caleb and I had acquired a map of this area, and the forest was only 6 miles across. That's what we had estimated, at least. That was how long that wood had any right to be. With what we thought was only a few more miles to go, we placated ourselves with the thought that the end of it could be nearby. Pinky chomped several times more, even after the path opened up again. Shortly after, my brother spotted something peculiar and shouted to me regarding it. There was a tree, fairly normal-like, but it had a tooth coming out of its trunk. At first, I thought it might be a fungus, but it wasn't. It was a man's molar, just as ordinary as the tree itself other than its placement. I soon spotted a couple more on the other side of it. We briefly discussed whether it was Indians or somebody off their rocker. Whatever the origin, it didn't sit well with either of us. Though we had left at dawn, we pursued that path until dusk, at which point it ran out at a cliff. Both the length of the forest and the break of the trail were completely unaccounted for on our map. The sun had been our assurance up to this point that we were at the very least going west, but now that was gone, along with our confidence. Going back was now clearly the smartest option, even if it meant being up all night. As though he knew what was coming, Pinky chomped again shortly before we returned to the thin portion. As we were crossing the ledge, Caleb's horse slipped. Caleb had wrapped his hands with the reins, so he tumbled down with his horse. As they fell down the incline, I heard a loud crack, which at the time I assumed was them hitting a tree branch. I eventually found a spot at which Pinky and I could safely descend, and I followed my brother's screams to find him. His horse had broken its neck, and he was trapped under it. It took some doing, but I got him out from under it. His leg was broken at the femur. Pinky was clacking his teeth furiously, so I tried to comfort him, but he backed up, refusing my attention. At this point, there was no trace of the sun, and the moon was full but covered up. I hauled my brother up on my shoulders and carried him over to Pinky, tried to lift him onto the saddle. But Pinky kept turning my way and looking right into my eyes with his locomotive grimace. I couldn't get my brother up there. I set my brother down and tied Pinky to a branch. Caleb was hurting too much to respond to me when I told him that I was going off to look for wood. It was damn near impossible to find anything in the dark like that. It was so dark that my hands were out in front of me to keep me from colliding with just about everything. Now and again, a tree or vine would pass across my hands. Caleb and I had to holler back and forth to one another to make sure I wasn't too far off from him. As I gathered sticks, I kept one arm free for safety. One of the trees that I touched had something smooth on it. I went back and felt it up, and sure enough, it was another tooth. This one was a front tooth. I can't recall the name of that kind of tooth at the moment. It unsettled me and got me wondering if I had passed along canines prior to this and mistook them for thorns. How many had my brother and I passed in the light, thinking they were mushrooms? Who would do such a thing, Claude? Why do something so strange and gruesome and make it so innocuous? I hollered out to Caleb, reporting what I had found. Caleb didn't answer. I called him again with the same result. I was still oriented to his position since our last exchange, so I went in what I hoped was his direction. I found Hatchet's body, but didn't see Caleb around. The moon was out and afforded me a look around, with which I saw Pinky's reins still tied to the branch. Pinky was not wearing them. I heard a furious chattering like a man in the cold. So again, I called for my brother. Looking for the source, I saw Pinky yards across from me, eyes glinting in the moonlight. It was him that was making the noise. I'd never in my entire life seen a horse chatter like that, nor had I before seen one stare at me that intensely. I'm properly ashamed to say that beyond a bit of yelling his name, I did not continue to look for my brother. I loved him dearly, but was gripped by a cowardice previously unknown to me. I know it would have been unlikely to find him out in the dark, but I feel it would have been honorable and right to look. Instead, I convinced myself that I'd find him better in the daytime and so should wait. I was able to get Caleb's flint from his saddlebag to start the fire. Pinky was my company, and ill company he was, ceaselessly chattering away through the night. Pinky stayed just beyond the fire's range of clarity, so all I could make out of him was his eyes and teeth. I had an urge then of reasons that I cannot articulate to pull out my piece and shoot him. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that between guilt and fear, I was unable to sleep that night. Near dawn, my surroundings revealed themselves. Many of the trees had teeth higher than anyone should be able to reach. Bones laid at the feet of some of these trees, I did not care to see the bones close enough to estimate where they came from. I was afraid to approach Pinky, menacing as he was at the moment, so I went up the hill to the path on foot. All the while, Pinky followed me without my use of the lead, though he rarely used to do anything of the sort. His chattering persisted. Nobody in town was keen on helping me find my brother. Pinky had stopped chattering, but he still followed me, waiting outside of buildings that I entered. After hours of asking around, one of the residents suggested that I consult a woman living north of ways, a woman who people paid on occasion to help them find things. I was in dire straits, so the consultation of a mystic was not preferable, but apparently my only option. She was seated outside a small cabin, drinking tea and eating an apple. She wore a widow's gown. She rose at my approach, but as I greeted her, she walked past me to stroke the mane of my horse. I asked her if she could help me find my brother, and she did not respond. I offered up what money I had, which was a modest yet considerable sum, but still she did not so much as look at me. She held up her apple to Pinky's mouth, asking him if he was hungry. At this, Pinky refused the apple, but his lip rose and he began chattering again. "Yes," she said, looking over to me, though now I did not like it. "You're very hungry." She leaned over to his mouth and smelled his breath. Then she smiled and said, "Even though you just ate." She ignored my attempts to get any real answer from her, sitting back down on her porch and consuming her apple. I got as close to Pinky's mouth as I was comfortable with and smelled his breath. The scent was foul, a carrion stench. I think now that I should have shot that horse. I considered it for days. Instead, I sold Pinky to a man who took him the next town over, but I think he's come back to me. A courier comes here once a month and he is here now, so I am sending this with him. I'll try to answer preemptively as many questions as I may fathom you would ask, so that you might be able to best apply your veterinary expertise. Were you to ask if Pinky's teeth or gums are discolored, I would say that they are not. If you were to ask if he seemed lethargic or otherwise under the weather, I would say he does not. If you were to ask if he has ever before looked at me with hatred, I would tell you not to my recollection. If you were to ask me if before entering those woods he ever stepped into the establishment that I was staying and waited outside my room, snorting and chattering, only to leave with no trace before dawn, I would say not to my recollection.